Good morning. Thank you so much for joining me for my lecture recital. I'm excited to share this special project with all of you. Back in 2016, when I was a student at the Royal Academy of Music in London, I found the score of Reisebuch in a dusty corner in the library there and was immediately fascinated by it. A little later, I made a professional recording of the first song. There are a couple of parallels between me and Ernst Krenek. Like the composer, I grew up hiking in the German, Swiss, and Austrian Alps and always found it to be the perfect balance to everyday life. I have always also been fascinated by literature, and especially so by the Austrian Jewish writer Stefan Zweig's The World of Yesterday, where he described how a world without haste and definite classes in Vienna and Austria before the First World War was turned upside down by the two world wars and the forces of modernity. It is unique to me to find this sentiment expressed in the song cycle that I will be discussing today. The title of Ernst Krenek's 1929 song cycle Reisebuch aus den österreichischen Alpen translates as Travel Book from the Austrian Alps, and the composition encapsulates the composer's lifelong spiritual reverence for the Austrian Alps as a sanctuary for self-cultivation. Quote, "I set out to travel to discover my homeland," constitutes the momentous phrase which opens the cycle and which functions as an overarching intellectual and musical theme for the entirety of the 20 songs. The allegory of the journey and its resulting path to knowing one's place in the universe embodied one of the central humanistic tenets of the Enlightenment in service of the formation of one's character. In the Romantic Age, which had seen the pinnacle of the German lied art form, the foray into nature had equally served as a transcendent cleansing ritual and soul-searching activity for the lonely traveler. And both Franz Schubert's Winterreise and Gustav Mahler's Songs of a Wayfarer constitute famous precedents in this tradition of a man's utopian exploration of nature. Krenek's journey, however, must be embedded into the larger processes of modernity. On the one hand, the Industrial Revolution in the Western world had produced a significant shift from a rural to an urban lifestyle during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. On the other hand, the increasing democratization and affordability of leisure time, coupled with the pollution of cities by automobiles and factories, had encouraged families to seek brief escapes into nature. The resulting local movement of people on a large scale also changed the concept of Heimat, of home. Recognizing the first seeds of globalization in the movement of people, German musicologist Matthias Schmidt argued that home as an affinity and attachment to a place had started to become questionable to modernity. By closely looking at excerpts of the first 3 volumes of Krenek's Reisebuch, I propose to demonstrate that despite acknowledging the legacy of its genre, this cycle constitutes a fundamental departure from tradition, and most extraordinarily engages in a thought-provoking dynamic between the concepts of tourism and Heimat against the backdrop of the age of modernity. In this lecture, I will give a brief overview of Krenek's background and of how Reisebuch fits into the totality of his work. I will then touch on the broader sociological issues of the phenomenon of Heimat and of mass tourism under the umbrella of the concept of modernity, and show how the presented excerpts of the cycle engage both musically and textually with different aspects of this larger context. Ernst Heinrich Krenek was born in the northwestern outskirts of Vienna on August 23, 1900, into a family of Czech lineage. Belonging to an upper middle class of a certain prosperity, his father followed the expected career path of an officer in the commissary corps of the Imperial Austro-Hungarian Army with the rank of captain, and his mother also came from a military family. Both parents raised their son with a sense of pride in his Czech cultural heritage. However, they spoke German at home and were loyal to Austrian Emperor Franz Joseph, who had remained in power from 1848 until 1916. Krenek would always highly value his Viennese citizenship, which he had acquired through birth, and his deep intellectual attachment to the city and its history come across in Reisebuch. he found his raison d'être away from the military legacy of his family and instead in the embracing of an elitist and wide-ranging education. Next to his composition studies with Franz Schrecker from 1916 onwards, he was immersed into a liberal secondary education with special emphasis on classical literature, which explains his later proficiency as a published writer and author of his own texts and libretti of his manifold vocal works. In his development as a composer, Krenek had reached a phase of yet unprecedented radical atonality in his Second Symphony, which was finished in May 1922. In February 1927, however, he gained international and long-lasting fame with his opera Johnny spielt auf, Johnny Strikes Up, in which he was credited to be the first European to explore his continent's vogue for and imagination of what the idiom of African-American jazz would sound like at the time. The bold experimenting with the new musical languages eventually made Krenek a target for the persecution of the Nazis, whose worldviews he deeply opposed. A caricature of his Johnny was used by the Nazis as the official poster for the infamous exhibition about so-called degenerate art in Munich in 1938, which consequentially led to his expatriation to the United States. The composer eventually embraced serialism later in life, and Epilogue, the last song of Reisebuch, which will not be included in the performance today, is one of the first examples of this development. Krenek's autobiographical Atem der Zeit, Recollections of Modernity, contains frequent stories of visits to the Tyrol region in Austria during his adolescence. He acknowledged that these journeys had decisively influenced his life. Before emigrating to America in 1938 after the Austrian Anschluss, he had organized his circumstances in a way that he could always remain in close proximity to the mountains for as long as possible. In spring 1929, Krenek undertook another trip through the western regions of Austria, during which he scribbled down notes and partly crafted the prose he would later use in the 20 Songs of Reisebuch, which was composed in only 20 days after he had returned to Vienna in July of the same year. If we take a closer look at the text of this travelogue, we may conclude that this journey of discovery constituted a very personal project for the composer. The ironic and humorous statements in some of the songs are occasionally dripping with sarcastic observations, and we may assume that the lyric persona coalesces with the composer's own voice. In his notes for Reisebuch, Krenek wrote that we wander here and there, seeking ourselves and our homeland, and end up knowing almost everything, except the country we belong to. He uses the German word irren for to wander, which suggests that a clear path and focus have been lost, and that there is some heightened movement implied. The character of exploring through hiking, as described here, thus proposes that nothing is experienced with depth. The shallowness of travel is further suggested by the many scenes in Reisebuch in which the composer pejoratively criticized the modern phenomenon of mass tourism. While he initially wanted to escape the so-called bustle of experience in the big city, he ultimately found himself confronted with a monumental crowd of leisure seekers that he called the assembled rabble, who came to invade nature with monstrous noise and stood out with their lack of education. Along the journey of Reisebuch, it becomes clear that Krenek's curiosity and urge to find evidence of his fatherland in nature results in the necessity to escape from what he calls the madness of these times, as represented in the outgrowth of mass tourism. The journey eventually leads him to consider a more intangible homeland, which turns out to be the eternal cultural legacy of his musical forebears, which he connects with back home in the city of Vienna. I would like to now look in greater detail at the issues of Heimat and tourism and how they influenced the musical story of Reisebuch. In Motiv, the first song of Reisebuch, Krenek defined the initial goal for his journey through the Austrian Alps. I set out to discover my homeland. He describes his multi-ethnic country as home to creatures of the most diverse lineage and asks the existential question of whether home for us means where we were born. This last thought suggests that the concept of belonging must not necessarily be tied to a geographic location, but could also be based on a certain education, cultural heritage, or worldview. William Rollins, a German studies scholar from New Zealand, suggested that the affiliation to a place demanded above all a negative definition. It was to be a rebellion against the big city and industrialism generally. What did Heimat therefore mean to Ernst Krenek, and why was his alpine journey so crucial in helping him discover it? The German term Heimat may be translated simply as home, referring to the backyard of your immediate surroundings, but it may also be translated as homeland or native country, which, in hindsight, has come to suggest a controversial dynamic of belonging and territorial aspiration, considering the German National Socialists' abuse of the concept of nationalism in the early 1930s and during the Second World War. Schmidt claimed that the term Heimat is no longer at our disposal without considering historical connotations of the 20th century. He argued that the discomfort of our present age and maybe of modernity in general towards the concept of Heimat points to something precarious with the matter itself. The matter, however, how stained it may present itself, exists. There is a Heimat as insult, as memory, as utopia, as humiliation, as imposition, as ideology, and as alleged or real place of existence. Reisebuch was composed only a few months before the great American stock market crash in October 1929 had unleashed a worldwide economic crisis, which, amongst other factors, had contributed to providing a fertile soil for Hitler's win in the 1933 federal elections in Germany. It is important to consider that throughout his life, Krenek had been a fierce opponent of the ideology of race and politics of the German National Socialists, and that his international success with his jazz-influenced opera Johnny Spielt Auf in 1927 had immediately put him at the top of their list of so-called degenerate artists. In the context of these historical developments, the composer's journey into the Austrian Alps could be seen as a genuine wish to rediscover and reconnect with what was still good and truly Austrian in his country. Austrian musicologist Gernot Gruber argued that the rootedness in the homeland and culture of Austria had permeated Krenek's life, who understood himself as an Austrian patriot with a clear distinction to what could be perceived as a German nationalistic patriotism. The search for what Austrian culture meant to Krenek becomes evident on both textual and musical levels in Reisebuch. It is interesting to note that a little while after the worldwide celebrations of the centenary of Franz Schubert's death had taken place in 1928, the composer embarked on a series of lectures on Schubert with the aim to reflect on his idol's so-called Austrian character. Not surprisingly, there are manifold references to Schubert's musical spirit in Reisebuch. Now I would like to ask you to turn to examples 1 and 2 in your handout, please. Motiv, the first song, opens with gently and gracefully pacing chords in the tonal center of E-flat major. Lothar Knessel claimed that Krenek had admitted the influence of Winterreise on the entire Reisebuch cycle, and this particular gesture in Motiv strongly suggests a similarity with the opening of the song Gute Nacht. German pianist Reinhard Schmiedl claimed that in this moment, Krenek brings the Schubertian dimension of estrangement into his cycle, since the poet Wilhelm Müller had already claimed, "I arrived a stranger I depart," in Gute Nacht. And Krenek, with similar intention, wrote, "I set out to discover my homeland, seeking ourselves and our homeland." Please turn to example 3. Our Wine, the 8th song of Reisebuch, furthermore constitutes a very close imitation of Schubert's folk-like G minor march for four-hand piano. Throughout the song, recurring sections contain a slowly unraveling upbeat, as well as slight emphases on the first and third beats in a 4/4 measure structure. This momentum-generating gesture is similar to the so-called Schwung, a motion often found in the Austrian folk dance of the waltz, which is normally notated in a 3/4 time signature. The text of the song praises and advertises with great detail and connoisseurship the variety of wine regions in Austria and reads like a profession of love for its countryside. Krenek writes that nothing is more beautiful than walking through vineyards in early summer. The composer takes the wine as an allegory for Austrian products in general, which only reveal their worth to people who truly want to discover them. He writes that because our wine appears too unassuming, it's savored only by those who know how to seek it out. These picturesque scenes in Reisebuch, however, are taken over by Krenek's seemingly shocking encounters with an inundation of outdoor seekers throughout his journey. In Looking Back, the 9th song of Reisebuch, he describes these impressions of mass crowding as the disintegration of life's worth and the coarsening of humankind. In A Greener Vision of Home, Rollins provided a study of the early German movement of environmentalism at the beginning of the 20th century, and because of the interconnectedness of Germany and Austria at that time, this text is also applicable in the present context. It is therefore interesting to point out that Rollins emphasized that there was an enormous upsurge in outdoor recreational activities, and that tourism to places of natural beauty climbed precipitously with better infrastructure and transportation. Overcrowding, pollution, and overstimulation through noise in modern cities constituted only some of the factors that turned the outdoors into a sanctuary of a healthier way of life. In Looking Back, the 9th song of Reisebuch, for instance, Krenek admitted that, city-born, following the bustle of existence, we see everywhere out there in the mountains the unattainable sources of life, evidence in every house of better times when we were still close to nature. In their study of alpine tourism in the Salzburg and Tyrol regions of Western Austria, Lawrence Cole and Katharina Scharf ascertained, however, that in the 1870s the move to large-scale tourism accelerated, accompanied by extensive infrastructure development, and that by 1914 tourist numbers reached new peaks. In Reisebuch, Krenek used the biblical allegory of the grasshopper plague in the story of the Jewish exodus from Egypt in order to convey to the listener to what extent the enormous numbers of alpine outdoor enthusiasts had gotten out of control. Whereas the exploration of nature had previously constituted a welcome counterbalance to modernity's hysteria and dangers of mechanization and monotony of the mind, the highly exploited alpine areas now ran the risk of being destroyed through mass tourism. In his dissertation on A Cultural History of German and Austrian Mountaineering in the first half of the 20th century, Lee Wallace Holt put it straight. Were the Alps still a geography of illumination, epiphany, and sublime beauty, the site of curative and restorative healing powers? Or were mountains a space endangered by mass tourism and the tourist industry a vanishing utopia in need of protection? This interest in the outdoors in Austria was shared not only by people from different social classes, but also by its constituent multi-ethnic nationalities and visitors from abroad. Krenek related that in Innsbruck, visitors from all over the world gathered and one could hear many languages spoken in the streets. He continued to describe the threat that emanated from the German and Austrian Alpine Association, which attempted to exclude so-called non-Aryans from organized activities facilitating the exploration of the Alps, and argued that already back in the pre-war period there were some sections which did not permit Jews as members. As a result, the Austrian Alps became a type of German reservation in which non-Aryan inhabitants of the Reich were only admitted as so-called guests. Now please turn to examples 4 through 7. Alpine inhabitants, folkloristic potpourri, the 11th song of Reisebuch seems to stand like a bulwark against this worrying type of nationalism, which was growing in Germany and Austria in the early 20th century. In a symbolic attempt to imagine a utopian world where all nations live together noisily but peacefully, we find here a juxtaposition of cabaret-style melodies, a neoclassic allegro barbaro reminiscent of Bartók's music, jazz-like harmonies and rhythms, and what you can see down here, the atonally inflected musical imitation of a needle that is scratching on the LP as it plays the newest popular songs of the time. The 11th song, furthermore, opens with the following phrase: "The Alps are inhabited by wild nomads. They come roaring here with monstrous noise. Each summer and winter, the patient trains spew out their hordes. With indescribable banality, they yell loudly and clearly into the landscape." The entirety of Reisebuch plays with that clash between the barbarism of the uneducated tourists and the primeval sanctuary of hitherto untouched nature. Krenek biographer John Stewart consequently called the composer a fastidious elitist who showed a distaste for the general populace, its pastimes, culture, and society, and argued that in many of his libretti and travel essays, he created the image of the people as a brute easily manipulated by tyrants and charlatans. The composer indeed uses a language in Reisebuch that doesn't shy away from condescendingly and contemptuously calling out those tourists who, in his view, disrespect the integrity of the Alpine region and its cultural heritage. In Monastery in the Alps, the 3rd song of Reisebuch, we encounter elegant monks whose sphere of learnedness and sophistication stands as a symbol for their engagement with existential questions of life, and which is invaded by what Krenek calls the assembled rabble. Holt argued that one reason for the advent of mass tourism in the German-speaking lands in the early 20th century was the accumulation of enough financial means to travel. The sense of entitlement that showed through this newly gained purchasing power is evident in Cemetery in a Mountain, the 6th song of Reisebuch. Referring to the local charnel house, which contains the skeletons of the dead, Krenek stated that for an entry fee of 50 groschen, you can gaze on the remains, and so it is that even the dead earn a living. The mass invasion of the Alps, which continued well into the first half of the 20th century, was made possible by the increasing sophistication, variety, and speed of novel means of transportation. Holt argued that the tourism industry's expansion was due primarily to the arrival of the railroad in the 19th century, which had heralded a new age for the Alps, both in terms of tourist possibilities and enormous change. In this context, it is interesting to look at the first phrase of Transport, the 2nd song of Reisebuch, where the automation and mechanization of life get imitated musically and textually. Please turn to example 8. Here, in the beginning, the vocal line steps up higher and higher in small intervals in a very jagged and highly rhythmic character as we read of the electric mountain railway, which takes visitors to the vertiginous heights of the Austrian Alps. This automated, machine-like singing is enhanced by percussive chords in the piano and then gets contrasted with longer and more pleasurable legato lines, as Krenek describes the multicolored spring meadows, in a possible attempt to show that nature evokes smoother and more agreeable states of being. In the 2nd song, we also experience images of the multitude of means of transportation which tourists use to access remote alpine areas. The music and language get more hectic as we are immersed into the bustle of people trying to secure a seat on the bus. Please turn to examples 9 and 10. Krenek pulls us right into the events in his prose. He writes that the driver can hardly get to his levers, and on the impossibly steep old road the bus often skids quite alarmingly. This spiraling out of control of the bus is set to a rising sequence of jittery and broken seventh chord motive, and as the vehicle threatens to slide down the road despite the chauffeur's attempt at braking, the piano plays chromatic and decelerating chords before the rapid and interrupted gesture in the left hand suggests that the bus finally did speed down the hill. Rollins argued that a primary function of the hike was to exercise what Trojan called the devil of speed and make possible a more reflective relationship to the land, although speed was, of course, not only related to the technological means, but also to the frame of mind. The circumstances of modern life irretrievably turned modern and more time-efficient transport into a companion of mass tourism. However, Krenek made it obvious in Reisebuch that he found fault with this modern, hectic, unfocused, and, in his view, uneducated frame of mind. In Homesickness, the 14th song of Reisebuch, Krenek elevates the city of Vienna to a temple of its cultural and intellectual history, which, he concludes, represent the true homeland. He writes that in the city are merged the image of life's abundance and the concept of wisdom. The urban context here serves as a metaphor for eternal knowledge, which in theory should be accessible to any individual. In my opinion, this song achieves an immediacy with the listener that is beyond comparison in the cycle. Please turn to example 11. In an almost spoken manner, the singer declaims in the beginning of the song that all is simple and honest, vast and violent in these Alps too. There, in the city, however, all is still wreathed in secrecy, the spell of dark, tangled, splendid history. With this in mind, Krenek employs a musical language which seems to be based on historical precedents. He employs a simple and recurring rhythmical formula in the right hand, which is reminiscent of Hugo Wolf's musical language in his songs and which is accompanied by an often harmonically surprising counter-melody. Please turn to example 12. As a contrast to the sparsity of the beginning, the listener will experience lush moments of Straussian momentum later on in that song, which are set to the words of Concept of Wisdom. Midway through Reisebuch, Krenek thus laments the decline of an intellectual history, which seems threatened by modernity and the dangers of the age of the masses and of technological advance. Hoping for a better world, at the end of the song, the lyric persona concludes by stating that, though some people deny this spirit, I shall remain faithful. It will surely be respected once more when the madness of these times is over. Like so many artists who had been displaced against their will by the persecution of the Nazis in the mid-20th century, Krenek's compositional and literary works throughout his career were crucially influenced by the theme of wandering. Jon Stewart argued that the composer's intense yearning for rootedness was to be of fundamental significance for his thought and art. After he had settled in America in the late 1930s, Krenek composed the 1944 Lieder cycle, The Ballad of the Railroads, which was premiered in April 1950 at Carnegie Hall in New York, and which can be seen as the American counterpart to his traveling experiences in Austria. Reisebuch particularly stands out in the art form of the modern German Lied because the artistic treatment of contemporaneous and highly relevant issues did not diminish their immediacy and message. While pushing the boundaries of musical style, Krenek achieved to establish a most thought-provoking discussion on the dynamics between the forces of modernity and the universal theme of home, which continues to inspire our present generation. Thank you. this concludes the lecture part of this event, and I would like to take a short moment to thank my two advisors for this lecture recital, Professor Watkins and also Dr. Harley, whom I have to thank for all these years here at Eastman for his guidance in my musical studies. And also Professor Watkins, we have a longer journey together still because I'm embarking on a PhD career in musicology. I also want to thank Sofia, who with her phenomenal storytelling will make this into a very special event. I want to thank my mother, who has been here for all my recitals, who came especially from New Jersey. And I want to thank my amazing media crew, Clara, Jamin, Tucker, for always being here and helping me with this recording. Thank you.
Zum die Gespenster, Gott, sie immer höher, did you make the selection of which songs to include and which songs to exclude in your presentation?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I think what was really important for me to show was the loudness and of the tourists, and also the modern overcrowding, which comes across in some of the songs, especially in the penultimate one. But it was really important to me to close with this one song in Book 3, because it expresses such a deep sense through the music of longing, of really wanting to find a homeland, and that was really what he found in the city. And it's so well described, especially in the language also, in the prose.
Do you, given what you just said, I'm just curious to know, do you think Krenek found his home?
I think he did find his home. I mean, what's important to understand is that he spent most of his life in America, and he taught at several institutions, and he found his home in the intellectual sphere, giving his knowledge to others, and also telling people about a culture in Europe that was extinct then because of the wars that did so much damage. But he was also often misunderstood. He was so detailed in the way that he gave his knowledge to others when he had found his home. So, yeah.
That was great. Thank you. The sounds are really wonderful. Thank you so much. Exposing us all to that. I'm curious, are there any songs that have texts that show Krenek actually having some kind of private, experience in nature that succeeded, or is he just showing everywhere he goes there are hordes of people and he can't ever have that kind of personal connection to the natural world?
I think the songs that show his personal experience in the natural world, I did not play today, but they mainly relate to the weather. And it's interesting, in the autobiography that I mentioned, that he wrote, I believe, in the 50s, which is very early considering he passed away in 91. There are very minute descriptions about how the vagaries of nature, the whims of nature, can really influence a hike, and he gives a lot of importance to those events, so they were very important to him. And those are purely concerns about nature, which are very interesting to me, but I did not include them today because I wanted to show the kind of veiled and also not so veiled criticism that he had. Yes,
I was impressed with the many styles, kinds of music that he wrote. And you mentioned the jazz influence. I wondered how he got the jazz influence.
That is a very good question, and I believe because he moved to Berlin in 1920 when he was only 20 years old to follow his teacher Franz Schrecker, who had just received an appointment at the Music Academy there, and I believe that he was exposed to all the cabarets, all the jazz music there, but I also know that he deeply despised Germany and Berlin because of all this mass culture, which to him was not culture. But that being said, he criticized the excess of the people there, but he truly loved jazz and he incorporated it into his opera. And the opera also has similar scenes in the Alps where people sit on verandas and play jazz music through gramophones.
Do you think his time in Paris in the early 20s might also, his connection with Ulysses, Stravinsky might also widen that horizon?
Oh yeah, definitely. I think especially in Alpenbewohner, you can hear that he's not just there's no, to my knowledge, no Schubert reference in there. So he's really taking the jazz influence and also the Allegro Barbaro, which I said reminded me of Bartók, but it could very well be the neoclassical style of Stravinsky as well that he incorporated in there.
Do you think he ever, as you said, he was a shameless elitist. Do you think he ever felt the need to reconcile his own contribution to tourism, his own travelling to get to where he wanted to be, the noise he created? I'm just curious. There's no right answer. I'm just curious on your opinion.
Are you saying that because he's also using the same motor cars and the same cable cars too?
I imagine he transported himself there in some way and he made some noise, and I imagine he also gawked at the same things that Earl also looked at.
I have to say that there were many artists who were persecuted by the Nazis who somehow ended up in America, but some of them came back to Europe. He chose not to do so, and I think America at that time stood for progress and Europe did not. And so I think although he was despising all the results of modernism that he saw, he kind of also understood that those were important because he made the choice to stay in America and to integrate into this culture here.
How do you think these songs, or where do you put these songs in relation to his total song output? How do they relate to other choices he made in the realm of song? He
wrote quite a few song cycles. There's also one song cycle, a later song cycle, that is influenced by Austrian folk tunes. Which were written later when he was already in America. He brought all these impressions with him, and he still worked on his memories of Austria in other song cycles. And I believe that there's also some folk elements in Reisebuch. But then again, he also wrote a lot of operas. Not Johnny spielt auf is his most famous opera, but he devoted himself a lot to the voice, to vocal works. That was very important to him.
Did he write Johnny spielt auf when he was already in the United States, or did he start before that?
It was premiered in 1927, so it was 2 years before the Reisebuch.
Did he speak about whether he would do the poems or the lyrics first and then the melody to them? And some of these songs that you did today, was it he had these thoughts about transportation or tourism and then decided what? Did he talk about, did you read about how he composed, like so many do one or the other, or have someone work with them?
Yes,
he did it all his own.
He wrote down some thoughts while he was traveling, and then he decided to set them to music. To my knowledge, he did not set anything to other people's prose. Or let's say maybe 98% of his works are his own prose. I don't know how he usually worked, if he had the music in his mind first and then the words, but in Reisebuch he definitely did write down the words first.
So well together.
I'm wondering about this notion of subjectivity in this piece, given that the references to Schubert are so many. I'm curious, in your ensemble, if there are moments, I think maybe building a little bit on what Holly was saying, are there any moments where you collectively or together decided that you wanted to portray self-discovery versus something that's really expository or a distraction from that enterprise of self-discovery? I guess I'm making the assumption here that in Schubert's cycles, even though the presumption is that you're going out into the world, what you actually do is discover something internal in that process. And I wonder if that journey holds in a cycle like this as well, and if so, where there were some moments that you might have found it together.
I think we approach this as a conversation between the two of us, and we had a thought behind it, but we did not set any parameters. We just let ourselves be inspired in every new performance, and I could tell that even today we were discovering new things. But I think what we wanted to show is that the way that Krenek found himself in the Alps was that he was more and more surprised and shocked at what was happening, and I think he transcribed it into musical and literary humor, and that is what we tried to bring across to the audience. That it's a matter of disbelief. Can this really be my country? Is this really happening here? He was leaving the city first because he was not feeling adequately, at peace there, leaving the noise and everything, and then he discovered this incredible chaos, and that's when he decided, I will go back and I will find my home there.
Were you surprised when you discovered some extraordinary kind of other poets that Krenek chose to cite? I'm thinking about Shakespeare and Blake and Tennyson and John Donne and Gerald Manley Hopkins. I was surprised on one level. Everyone has a right, of course, to choose their text, but how did that fit in? How does that fit into your perception of Krenek as someone who's looking for the spoken word and who oftentimes writes his own spoken word?
I don't know those settings, but I know that it has been a discussion for, let's say, at least a century now, whether or not it is better as a composer to set your own prose or to take someone else's words. And Debussy, for example, has a famous quote where he said, it is so difficult to interfere with the rhythm of a poetry that's already existing, so I'll write my own. And I believe that in Krenek, I was so touched by this cycle because it's so incredibly personal, and I listen to it and it just speaks to me, and I feel like this is happening today. And I think this spontaneity of thought that's coming across through the prose is so very well expressed through the music, and this can only happen when you have your own prose that you set to music.
One last question. You mentioned in your talk that there were parallels between you and the composer, and I wonder if you could expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, so all the photos you saw today are my own photos, my own hiking experience and my Vienna experience. I was there very recently, also in Vienna, and there was a photo of the Burgtheater, the famous theater, and I was there in December 22, and I saw Faust, Goethe's Faust, and it is really incredible when you walk through these streets and you see these major works, how the spirit that Krenek mentions is really still there, walking the streets. And I think personal experience helps when you perform this kind of cycle, because as I was playing the last song, I was imagining myself walking through the streets. Thank you.